Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Council Infrastructure Committee meeting for April. It is on the 11th today. We've had to move that, so I'm glad all you were able to adjust. And sorry about that. We try to keep those regular, but sometimes we have to move them. So one comment to start tonight. We're going to start with our small cell item, but I'm asking members of the audience that want to comment to for each entity that wants to comment to put all their comments together and have one spokesperson for you give those comments. So we have make sure you get all your information in there and gather that while we're doing this. So with that in mind, we'll start with the agenda AB 7535, the amendments to Issaquah Municipal Code regarding small cell design guidelines. And Mr. Keith Niven will lead us in the presentation.
Thank you, and good evening, Infrastructure Committee. So this evening, we're going to, this is our second time at Infrastructure Committee. I don't have a new presentation, so I'm going to upload my old presentation, but we have a new memo. And I have Daniel Kinney from Ogden Murphy Wallace here to answer questions, and Brett Heath from Public Works Operations. And I may call a friend later to help with questions. So, so basically what we're talking about is replacing the existing wireless communication facilities section of Chapter 18 in the City Code, which was written at a time when the city was getting ready for the macro cell towers that came as the first wave. And as we've learned, and the providers have informed us, you know, where we're at right now is coverage is pretty good, but there needs to be additional facilities to handle capacity issues. So it's really more of a capacity conversation than it is a coverage conversation. So we have gone in and changed our code to address these new facilities, which are much smaller in size, but they're also the range is much smaller. So there's more facilities, shorter spans between them. But they can basically go in a lot of different places, and so our code has to be written in ways that has expectations for them to be put on a light pole in the right-of-way, for them to be mounted, say, to a rooftop or the side of a building, or to be put in a public place like a park or on a water tower. And these things, here's some different images of what these can look like. Each provider has a little bit different look and housing for their facilities, but they're a lot smaller in scale than the macro towers. But as we talk about our light poles, and I'm just kind of giving some context for those who didn't see this last time, and as a reminder for the committee, we have a number of different light poles within our city. Some of them are, I think you would say, non-decorative, like this wooden one in Old Town, although it has character. But we have a lot of very neighborhood unique light poles, like the ones in Issaquah Highlands and Tallis, and even on Front Street. And Gilman right now is kind of developing a black shoebox style light pole. And a lot of these more neighborhood decorative light poles are much shorter in height than, say, the larger wooden utility poles that dot some of our other neighborhoods. So this was a slide. I've modified it by adding number 9. This was brought up before but was not on my list, which is the siting criteria and the discouraged locations. And we got a couple letters in from the carriers over the past couple days, and it reminded me that that one of the things that they were unhappy about was the process that they had to go through to move from an encouraged location to a discouraged location. I think it was described as being onerous. So what you have in front of you is a red line code. So there are some changes that staff have made since the agenda bill first came to committee. And those are annotated in my memo. And we can go through this memo if you would like, or we can have questions, or we can let the carriers make comments at the committee's discretion. But I don't think, let me say this, there have not been new issues added. The issues that we knew about previously are still, I think, the areas where the providers are hoping the city will change its code in one way or another.
And so we're going to go get a little more out of you for a minute. In a minute, just want a quick reminder, in case some people weren't here last month, that this discussion started last month. You had a proposal. There were some concerns about a few of the parts, most of it agreed upon. And what the committee here was said, go back and spend another month, talk about it, see if there's any things that we can improve with a little more communication. Or change, or is it worth it or not? Where's the value and the benefits? And so that's what you're coming back to us with at this point in time. It's months of discussion and communication. So why don't you then tell us exactly that? So from go over those items
Sure.
As that were of interest, and then state where they were last month, and if there's been any discussion or changes on any of those during this time.
Okay, so I'll go through this list of 9 and give you a quick summary. And if you'd like me to go deeper, let me know. Or if you have questions, please let me know. So number 1 is what we've identified in our draft code is that for level 2 permits, we would require the applicant to provide public notice. And a level 2, if you go to the processing piece, it's really the installation of a new pole. So, what we're talking about is if you're going to put some new poles in the right-of-way, I think our take on the administration's position is you should notice the neighbors, let them know that they're going to have some new poles out. If you're just putting if you're just putting a pole on or an antenna on top of an existing utility pole, that would not be a level 2, and that would not require public notice. The second item is we're requiring pre-application meetings. The ask from the providers was to limit those only to level 2. What staff believe is pre-application meetings are actually very facilitative discussion between the staff and the applicant to help make sure that when the application does come in, it has all the information that we believe is necessary for us to do a complete review. So we don't see this as being a penalty. We actually seeing this as help facilitating the review of the applications. Number 3, we are also changing Chapter 3 fees to add a fee for doing this review. We heard concern from the providers that fee was too high. Macro towers, right now in the existing wireless communication code, macro towers can be located in single-family zones. As we thought about that and thought about somebody putting a macro tower in their backyard and what that might feel like as a neighbor, we thought that probably is something we should change. And so that is actually, we're taking something away that was in the previous code by prohibiting them in single-family zones. Small cell, number 5, prohibited poles on Front Street. This was a discussion, we had a lot of discussion at the Planning Policy Commission about this. Right now, Front Street and the sidewalks that we have in Front Street are not really that wide, even though we have a streetscape plan to provide wider sidewalks in some places. And so the concern about putting new poles in the Front Street right-of-way is really putting it in the sidewalk zone. And so what we did, and we originally said no facilities on Front Street. Then we kind of changed it to no new, nothing in the right-of-way, and then we basically kind of got to a place where we said just no new poles. So if they can find another place, like an existing pole or mounting it on the side of a building, that would work under the proposed code. Number 6 is municipal poles. We talked about that a little bit last time. I'm glad Brett Heath is here tonight to talk about that a little further with you if you would like to. There's also a memo in your packet from Brett on concerns for the placement of wireless facilities on municipal poles. 7, decorative poles. So some of these are owned by homeowners associations, and they're not municipal poles. But as I mentioned earlier, they are generally not of a scale that meets the height expectations of the providers. And so what would have to happen is there'd have to either be an extension on top, or those poles would have to grow in size to be at that vertical height that the providers are telling us they need those antennas to be. And so our take on it was that that would be an unfortunate aesthetic outcome. And so we've also said no to decorative poles. New poles, there's a little bit of confusion. Well, there could be some confusion about this. We originally were suggesting new poles could be as high as 45 feet, but we were also requiring co-location. And the providers, through subsequent meetings, the providers told us that they can't do that. And so as we got rid of the requirement for co-location on new poles, there's no need to have the poles as tall as what we were originally proposing. So we suggested 25 feet. And as we heard last time, the providers are telling us 25 feet's too short. And so did some research, and I gave you all a handful of examples of cities and what heights they were allowing poles. And so the administration is changing its recommendation to 30 feet. I think we're still hearing from the providers they think that's too short, but as Boulder and San Francisco have allowed, 30 feet seems to work. So we're sticking with 30 feet as a recommendation. And then siting criteria, this is the last one, number 9. This is about, what we have done in our chart is basically for siting is we've created areas, so this is within 1822, 90, and we've created encouraged areas and then discouraged areas and then prohibited areas. And so if you want to get to that discouraged column, what we've created is a process that you have to basically eliminate anything in the encouraged column before you can jump to the discouraged column, as opposed to just saying, well, I really want to go here, that's in the discouraged column, just let me go there. And you guys didn't suggest that. Sorry, I was being dramatic. But you basically have to eliminate the stuff in the encouraged section before you can get to the discouraged section. So I have, so Daniel was my master at building that section, so if there is questions about that particular piece of it, I would probably defer to Ogden Murphy-Wallace. So that's the 9. Those are, I think what this doesn't show is, I think the initial comments from the carriers were a lot more. I think the city has done a lot of response to try and accommodate. There's clearly at least 9 things that we're still maybe not quite on the same page, but I think we think this is a pretty reasonable outcome.
Thank you. Questions?
So I understand that there's a lot of demands for the small cells for capacity. I'm wondering what the demands in the future for siting of macro towers will be. How likely is this to actually be impacting residents in the next few years?
So that's a great question, and I will be more than happy to let them answer that. What I've heard from them is that, you know, the macro coverage and the micro capacities work together. So at some point, and I don't know that they know specifically whether they will or won't need another macro location in our city, they think that that's a possibility. And so they are concerned about reduction in location where they could put a macro cell. But unless they are offering something new tonight, what I've heard is, I haven't heard them say they definitely are looking at new macro sites in the city, but I think they think that's definitely a possibility. And then there's also an unknown about 5G, and when 5G comes, what demand is that going to place on both the macro and the small cell networks?
Okay, and a follow-up, it wasn't previously prohibited from single-family zones. Were they cited in single-family zones?
Not that I know of. I think all of our macro towers right now are in right-of-way on public property, both water reservoirs and in parks. And is the one on 221st in right-of-way or is it on private property?
It's on private property.
So there's one on 221st that was part of an auto body facility.
Okay, but also not
But none in
single-family if it's auto.
We have not had any show up in somebody's backyard yet, so it seemed like this was a great opportunity to take that off the table.
This is a comment that I was in a little city nearby here just a couple days ago, and it was a neighborhood, and all of a sudden in the middle of this thing was this big, huge macro tower, right? But I don't know, I think the tower might have come first and the houses built up around it, I don't know. But all of a sudden I was like, oh. Anyway. Anything else? No? Good? Okay. All right.
I'm not going anywhere.
Comment, discussion. You want to do that first? Okay. All right. Well, then we'll do public comment now. So take your turns, line up, one person per entity, please.
Thank you very much, Councilmember Kim Allen of the Wireless Policy Group for Verizon Wireless tonight. I did send a letter to the committee this morning by email to kind of.
Was received.
Thank you, thank you. You know, and I think, as Keith said, we've worked through a number of these issues, and for Verizon, we really only have 4 remaining. We'll start with number 9, because that's first in the letter that I sent. I have a greater understanding of what staff's objectives are with this, but it's still, I think that the concern that we have is we'll rule out a site, an existing site, because we can't get a lease on it or because it's technically infeasible to site there. But this code section requires that we demonstrate that we can't get a lease on all of them. We have to contact all of the properties within 150-foot radius of each of these proposed poles in order to meet the requirements of this section. And sometimes on many sites, it's that the RF engineers say that won't work for us and this is why, as opposed to the pole owner won't give us a lease. So we're just asking that we be able to meet this section, the requirements of this section, by demonstrating either that it's technically infeasible or that we cannot secure a lease from any property within 150 feet. That's the change that Verizon is requesting for that. Macro sites in residential zones. And I think you're correct, you don't have any within your residential zones now. And for Verizon's perspective, we do want to keep the option of siting additional macro sites here. This is a rapidly expanding community. You're growing, you're building out, and we're certainly going to need to beef up our macro network as well as our small cell network. However, one of the compromises that we suggest, we certainly don't think that there should be a macro tower in somebody's backyard either, quite frankly. So what we're suggesting is we clarify the prohibition so that we are permitted to site a macro facility on non-residential uses. Let me turn this around. That the prohibition apply only to non-residential uses in residential structures in residential zones. We would like to keep the option open for churches and also maybe commercial locations, neighborhood commercial that would be within a residential zone, to be able to go there. And so we're asking that you prohibit the macros on lots that have a residential use on them. So that would leave open places like churches, places like schools, where we could site a ballpark light in a school field that's in a residential zone, or on a church steeple that's in a residential zone. We could also do a stealth monopine to blend in with the trees that are typically on those sites as well. So I have proposed language that would pull back the macro, the allowance in residential zones, but still give us a little bit of flexibility to add coverage to some of these new areas that are coming online for you. In terms of the height of the new poles, and I understand that Councilmember Ramos, I saw some comments from your last meeting where you wondered why, if we wanted to go on the 25-foot poles or the shorter poles, the decorative poles, why we needed additional height. And I took that back to the Verizon RF engineers, and the answer is, if we were going to go on one of those smaller, shorter decorative poles, we probably wouldn't be able to go right on that pole. What we would have to do is to expand it in height with a very similar complementary design that would try to complement or match the decorative pole, but would definitely be taller. So allowing the height of a new pole to be not 30 feet, but up to 35 feet, unless a carrier demonstrates that the number of nodes needed is reduced by the additional height up to 40 feet. And that's my RF engineers told me that you can, sometimes just those few feet means that they can reduce the number of poles because they can position the antennas a little bit differently, they can achieve some tilt, they can address terrain issues. And so what we're proposing is 35 feet, which has been pretty much customary, in fact, on the low side of the height restrictions in the Puget Sound area. You know, certainly Boulder and San Francisco don't have the tree challenges that we have here, and the terrain challenges, certainly not in Boulder. So we would ask that you look at the comparables from the Puget Sound region as that Keith has given you as kind of the benchmark. And for Verizon's perspective, 35 feet is fine. We would like the ability to go up to 40 feet if we can show you that we'll cut the number of poles down as a result. And then finally, on the municipally owned poles, and I think you saw in Mr. Heath's memo a number of different pole types that you have here in the city of Issaquah. And by excluding attachment to all municipal poles, you are faced with a clear policy choice as a council, which is, do you want a lot of new poles in the right-of-way? Because they have to go somewhere. And many of your neighborhoods, especially your newer neighborhoods, are undergrounded. And so light poles, new poles, certainly in the neighborhoods that have the not decorative poles, the ones that are wood with just the light standard attached to that, I mean, those poles we would definitely want to be able to attach to the same way that we're permitted to attach to a wood utility pole that's owned by Puget Sound Energy. So the blanket prohibition, I guess, is what's troubling. And because it will require another code change. If in the future you find out that, wow, new poles, too many, let's open up these assets, we're going to have to go through the Planning Commission and go right back through this process again to be able to basically change the policy if you want to. As the pole owners, you can say no right now. You own these poles. You can say, not this one, not any of them. On the proprietary side, when we would have to come and get a lease from you to use any of the municipally owned assets. At that time, you have complete design control, and sitting in your proprietary capacity, you have the right to say no to those. All we're asking is that the zoning code, which takes so much process to change, not prohibit municipal poles, but put them in the discouraged category instead. And finally, we would really like to thank staff and Mr. Kenny. This has truly been a collaborative process. We've taken a number of these things off the table, at least from Verizon's perspective. We consider them resolved, and would ask for your help just on these last 4 to get a workable path forward so that we can start providing this infrastructure to the residents of Issaquah as soon as we possibly can. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Linda Atkins. I'm here speaking on behalf of T-Mobile. I just want to generally say that for the most part, we agree with Ms. Allen's comments and suggestions. I just wanted to offer a little bit of additional perspective about macro sites in single-family zones. Part of the work that I do for T-Mobile includes representing them when they have difficulty in getting a site permitted. And a lot of times those cases involve sites in single-family zones. And one of the things that pretty much all jurisdictions around Puget Sound do with respect to those poles is they will allow them on properties in single-family zones that are devoted to non-residential uses, so like churches or schools, and they give us the opportunity to justify the site through a conditional use permit. So we have to justify that the height that we need, the location that we need, and we have to do everything we can to make that site blend into the right-of-way. And we really would encourage the city of Issaquah to follow that model. And the reason is, particularly as the demand for wireless services has grown, many times the gaps that we might still have in coverage are going to wind up being in a residential area. And if we don't have those options to fill those gaps, then we're in a situation where we've got customers who may not have service. So that would be the reason to encourage you to follow the typical format that most other jurisdictions follow. The other suggestion I would have about macro sites is in looking at Mr. Niven's memo, he explains that the code change wouldn't preclude a new macro tower to be located in the right-of-way. And so I would suggest in 1822-090, which is the section of the draft that has the table for where you can site a macro facility, in order to clear up the confusion that we at T-Mobile had about that issue identified in Mr. Niven's memo, is under the prohibited column, if that said property outside the right-of-way zoned single-family, those various subcategories, I think that would make it a lot more clear. Without that language, there's nothing within this wireless ordinance that lets you know that apparently in Issaquah, the right-of-way is not zoned. I talked to Mr. Niven about this before the meeting, and I think he's not opposed to making that change. So, and the other topic that I want to very briefly address is just to join Verizon Wireless in their comments about access to municipal poles. I think the point that Ms. Allen made about letting that decision be left to the proprietary leasing process is an appropriate one. It leaves the city in control, but it doesn't leave you as one of the only jurisdictions in the Puget Sound region that just simply won't allow access to municipal poles at all. And I think she articulated the policy reasons very well. If you don't allow access to municipal poles, you're creating a situation where there is going to be a proliferation of new poles in the right-of-way. Mr. Heath provided a memo that articulated a number of concerns the administration has about access to municipal poles, and we're, very much respectful of those concerns. And without going into a lot of detail, I would just say that those are issues that we do work with other jurisdictions to resolve, and I think that all of those concerns can be addressed And we would just urge you to at least give us the option to come to you and ask for a lease on a municipal pole if the need arises. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Sarah Springer with the Wireless Policy Group as well, and here on behalf of AT&T this evening. And I realize I'm a new face, so we appreciate your giving us this opportunity for a second round of comments. And I want to first reiterate what Ms. Allen had stated, thanking staff for the work that they have done on this code. And my colleagues getting me up to speed for this evening, it was very clear that a lot of progress has been made over this code, as you are well aware as well. So we thank you for that. And also, Mr. Kenny, I've actually had a chance in my previous city attorney life to work with, so he was a joy to work with then, and it's no surprise that he's been great through this process as well. So we want to reiterate that thanks to staff for that. There's not much more to add for the heavy lifting that my colleagues already did regarding some of the remaining issues that's for your consideration this evening. We did supplement a second comment letter today as well, in addition to the March 14th letter that was submitted. The three main remaining issues were the ones that my colleague Kim Allen articulated very well, that I'll kind of go in reverse order just briefly, that the prohibition on municipal poles in the right-of-way, not much more to add to that, just to reiterate what's already been said about allowing those to move forward and using that proprietary leasing process to iron out some of those concerns and concerns that we respect regarding safety and management of those poles, but leaving that to the leasing process to work that out. As noted, it's extremely common and commonplace and common practice for the carriers to work that out through the leasing process with pole owners. We did also make a comment in the letter to make the point, and I believe it was raised in one of the memos, that AT&T does have 24/7 response available for poles. So should an event occur to a pole and there was a need for resources to be reached, there is that 24/7 technicians available to service facilities, AT&T facilities on poles. Again, with the pole, municipal poles in the right-of-way. The only other thing that I will add is that if you look at congestion in Issaquah and you look at where that capacity really is needed, we're looking at Front Street and Gilman Boulevard. So you look at then that issue of, that policy issue of, are you going to have more poles or just more facilities on city-owned poles? And that's for you to think about, especially on Front Street. If no new poles are allowed on Front Street, that could potentially mean that there's no small cell facilities on Front Street if we're not allowed to go on city-owned poles. So that's for your consideration for that municipal pole prohibition. And finally, for the height extension, we mirror Verizon's comments and suggestion of the 35 feet up to potential of 40 feet. Again, for the same reasons that Ms. Allen articulated from her RF engineers, but is fairly general. The more height you get, the better coverage that you could potentially get from the facility, which means then potentially fewer number of poles that are needed to get the coverage that's desired in that area. So with that, again, thank you for this second time, and happy to answer additional questions and provide additional information too as needed.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Connie Marsh. I live up on Squawk. So for what seems to be the 4 remaining issues, San Francisco may not have trees, but they have massive humongo buildings that block more than trees ever would. So I'm not exactly sure why pole height would work in San Francisco and not work in Issaquah. And then I keep hearing conversation about poles, like poles are the only opportunity. But my understanding is in the commercial areas, which are along Front Street and Gilman Boulevard, and will be increasingly tall and close to the road, you have the opportunity to negotiate with private owners to site your things. The city is not the only place where you can put stuff, nor is the right-of-way. I have no particular problem with clarifying that the right-of-way is not zoned property, because who wants to get into that conversation with anyone? You're looking at me confused, Sheldon. Did you understood what I was saying there? Yes, okay, good. I may be the only person who understood what I said. Then what was the fourth one? Oh, I'm just going to have a general thing. 5G coming, small cells, this code, I see this as a short-term thing anyway, because if we are truly on the edge of a change in wireless, then we're going to be back here in 2 years having the same conversation. And I think, as proposed, this is a step in the proper direction. Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else? Excellent. All right, thank you very much. Public comment. Time for discussion. Yes, go right ahead.
I have a question about the 35 feet. So on this slide, it says 25, but I understand it's actually 30. And then there were a number of heights thrown out there by the carriers just now. I'm also so I'm looking at the March 25th version, and it has some wording about extensions of poles, maximum 10 foot taller than the existing pole, et cetera. And so is this max of 30 feet actually the maximum pole that would be a new pole? Or okay, so if
For a
there was
new-
an
for a new
existing
pole.
pole, they could, if there was an existing pole that was 30 feet and they did a 10-foot extension, it would be a 40-foot pole.
Right.
Okay.
So if you have an existing pole, whether it's a light pole or a utility pole, they can do an extension on top of that. What's now being proposed by the administration at 30 feet would be for a brand-new pole, just for a wireless facility.
Okay, and then there's also an extension of 10 feet, and then there's an extension that was added of 15 feet. Am I? It can be replaced with a pole that, it can be, okay, replacement poles can be replaced with a pole that is maximum of 10 foot taller than the existing pole, or it can have a pole extender that's 15 feet taller than the existing pole. So I'm just wondering, what is the sort of tallest poles that would result from this code?
It would depend on how tall the existing pole is, right? I mean, so if you've got,
So on Gilman, those are pretty tall, light poles, but they're.
Gilman, those are pretty tall. So I'll go back to, let's assume this is not a city-owned pole and is owned actually by PSE. So they could, if putting their antenna at the top of this pole was not, did not work, they could either stick an extension on this pole or do a replacement pole. But it would depend on the overall height. The resultant height at the end of the day would be a function of the height of this existing pole, right? Because both the replacement utility pole and the extension are based on the base that's already there, really.
Right. So I guess my general understanding of why there is the 30-foot limit on the new poles is so that we do not have a lot of really tall poles. And it's a balance between tall poles and lots of shorter poles. But I'm wondering about these 10-foot replacement extension of what's existing versus the 15-foot increase on an existing pole, why those are different also?
I think that's a great question. And I can tell you that I might have to think about that for more than like 30 seconds. So if you have another, if I can ask you to move on to another question, I can start thinking about why those are different.
I do have another question.
Right.
Can I ask a question of Public Works Operations Director?
That'd be awesome for me. Thank you.
Thank you for the memo that you provided. I found it very helpful. It answered most of my questions, and I actually just have a question about the other considerations part of the memo, which is about the indicated that installing battery backup equipment is not necessarily the carrier's decision, then that it may be a regulatory requirement. So with that, is that a consideration having to do with ground equipment, or I guess I don't fully understand the implications of that.
Okay, I'll try and answer that. Maybe the carriers can chime in if they need to as well. This came out of our meeting that we had with the carriers, and we were talking about the 17 cubic foot definition of small cells and the equipment that is not included within that definition. And there's a list, there's a whole paragraph of equipment that is not included within that, and some of the power supply equipment, including the battery backups, seems to fall in that category. We were informed at that meeting that the decision to install battery backups or not install them is not always the carrier's, at the carrier's option. They certainly could install them if they elected to do that, but there are times when the regulatory environment says this site will have a battery backup. So I don't know the details on that. They could probably provide you with more information, but that's the genesis of the comment. And to understand that there's other equipment outside of this 17 cubic foot footprint that could be installed.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
Anything, Stacy? Okay. How are you doing, Keith?
So I'm
I got the same question I was trying to get to, so.
So I'm going to need to ask Councilmember Hunt. So I found the 15-foot reference. Where's the 10-foot reference?
So I'm on page 18 of the March 25 version. Is that the right version?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Replacement
Yeah.
poles under A?
It's the top of the 19th page, actually.
Oh.
It's the 19th page of the memo that's...
I think that is just a, I'm gonna say that's a disconnect. I think that it should be 15. We originally had 10 throughout, and were asked to increase it to 15. So I think my answer would be that that it should be consistent with sub C of that section, which is 15.
And the other part of the question is just how tall the resultant tallest pole is likely to be. Yeah, so on Gilman, 40 feet plus 15 feet, so we're talking about 55-foot pole, essentially.
If it's allowed on a municipal pole, right? I mean,
Or-
so part of this is if there's an existing utility pole, or, you know, because this section is dealing with replacement poles, so it's replacing an existing. And if you're kind of keying in on this black shoebox, for example, if we're not allowing them on municipal poles, you could not extend this particular facility. There would have to be another, and if we agree to 30 feet, there would be another 30-foot pole with antennas on it in this vicinity, right? So this section is for replacing existing poles, and right now, where we have, as you've heard, where we have underground power, there are no existing poles in the right-of-way. It's only where you have overhead lines that they would replace an existing pole to get the height separation from the existing facilities to be able to put their antennas.
So maybe Gilman is not the best example, but for example, also on Squack Mountain, the utility poles are pretty tall. And so I think those are probably also 40 feet. I'm not sure, but we're talking about
So we're-
potentially a
yeah, we're looking at this one
55-foot
right here,
replacement
right?
pole.
So I think, I think that you're right. I mean, if indeed they wanted to locate on this particular pole, and if the top of the pole was not at a height that accommodated their facilities, then they would want to replace this pole with another pole, which could be up to 15 feet taller. That's what the code would say.
Okay, so I guess my comment on this is that I wonder if we should have a maximum pole height total. If you have a really tall existing pole and then they're tacking a 15-foot tall on top of it, it could be a very tall replacement pole.
It could be.
Go ahead.
So let's go back to that Squack Mountain example, and you're talking about whether that pole gets replaced, and I assume the carriers might want to replace that pole with a taller one. So how does that happen? I mean, who owns that pole? Do they just request it and we have to replace it? I mean, how does that work?
So that pole could be owned by PSE. So they would contact PSE and say, pole number, whatever number this is, we would like to place facilities on that pole, and we need them to be at a higher level to get the coverage to wherever the next pole is. And so they would work that out with the pole owner.
And then they apply and then they apply for a permit to
Right.
replace it, and then the code would say, if it's 40 feet tall, you could be 55 feet tall.
55 feet, right.
So here's my question as we look at that, because you're going back to the 10 feet or 15 feet, which is confusing. So the replacement pole can be a maximum of 10 feet taller than the existing pole, but an extender can be 15 feet taller. So that
Right, so
So that feels strange in the same place. If you put an extender, you get 5 more feet. If you put a new pole, you get 10 more feet.
right, they should be the same.
And which should they be, 10 or 15?
So originally we had 10 throughout, is my recollection. The carriers asked for the 15. The 15 seems to be consistent with many other jurisdictions. So we allowed for 15 feet and didn't catch the 110 up in sub A. So if you were asking me for a recommendation, I would say it should be consistently 15.
And if we were to ask you for a recommendation on using a maximum height, what would your response be? Or if you don't know, then?
I think it depends on the neighborhood. I think they have very different light, as you can see from this collage of photos. They're very different characters of light standards. I think that where we do have decorative poles, I don't think that there should be an allowance for any extension, which is one of the reasons why we've suggested prohibiting them. I think if you look at the Front Street example, thinking about another one, a somehow version of this on steroids, which might be up here, is just not going to look right on that streetscape. And likewise, as you go down Park Drive and you see all the Issaquah Highlands poles at this height, having one that's significantly taller aesthetically would be a problem. You know, where we have less designed poles, you know, I have a different take on that, and I think, but the neighbors who live in those neighborhoods may not. So that's the hard part about this. I think there's very much, it's very different depending on which neighborhood you're talking about.
So I guess getting back to, in most places, I didn't see a need for much than more than 45 feet, just in my reading. So I guess if that's about the maximum height anyone would need for a small cell, that'd be something worth mentioning, so it wouldn't go above that? Or
Do we want to ask one of the carriers to provide some technical input on this?
Sure.
Or?
let you speak for all of them for a moment.
Yeah, I think there's some confusion. I think that the 15-foot extension, either by replacing the pole or by a pole extender, applies only to existing utility poles that are owned by PSE. Those are the only poles that they would, and sometimes PSE will have a light standard, but generally they have electrical lines on there. And so PSE has a requirement that if a carrier wants to go on one of their utility poles, they can only go pole top, which means we have to extend the height of the pole by the amount of safety clearance that's required by the National Electrical Codes. So that is the reason and the sole reason for extending these poles. And so we meet the pole at the height that it's at, and we have to go between 7 and 10 feet above the lines. And that is the bottom of the antenna. So then a 2-foot antenna on top of that, and we're talking about asking for the minimum necessary to achieve those safety clearances. And typically it's around 15 feet. This is not a requirement that the carriers want. We would rather go in the middle, because the sweet spot for the placement of a small cell antenna is between 20 and 35 feet, generally. Up to 40 if you're going to try to reduce the number of poles that you're going to be using in terms of new poles. But 40 feet is pretty much the maximum that anyone would need.
So what you're saying is not anything over 40 feet doesn't buy you any more?
It doesn't buy us anything, but we have requirements from the pole owners that are outside of our control, and that's what drives those height increases. And we will always ask to do the minimum that we need to achieve those clearances.
Thank you for that clarification. And to clarify what I was getting back to, we're looking at these but we're not talking about City of Issaquah poles now, we're talking about other utility poles, PSE or whoever, but, so those are the ones we're looking at. And we may have a light standard on one of their poles by permit as well, but it's their pole.
Right.
Right. Okay. So I guess the question back to you is that if that's a requirement that for technical stuff, and you could have a pretty tall pole there, if on some of those that we have in, like say Squack Mountain, some of those places are pretty tall. It could end up being pretty large, but if you limit it to maximum of 45 feet and it's a 40-foot pole, there's no room to put anything on it. That's what it sounds like to me. Right? I'm getting head nods from the audience. Okay. Thank you for that clarification. Other comments, discussion?
Is it always very clear what qualifies as a decorative pole? I'm wondering about those shoebox. They seem decorative, but I'm just wondering how much, how objective that is.
I'm checking my definition section. I think that would be a great add for a definition for what a decorative pole is. So my opinion would be that the Gilman shoebox, so the shoebox is not a standard light fixture is a Cobra head. And so whether it's on its own metal pole, on a concrete pole, or on a wooden pole, that's a standard light fixture. Anything else would be decorative. So
I have more questions. I'm going to kind of sum up a couple of things I heard here, okay? One is we have a technical error and an A to change 10 feet to 15 feet to be consistent, and we'd like to do that. So I'm not sure the process to do that, but however, we have to do
I'll
that.
do that in the updated agenda bill. So there'll be a new ordinance that'll have that change reflected if the committee
If
makes
we
that
look at that,
recommendation.
right, well, yeah, but that's, one thing was mentioned. Oh, there's one other thing.
There was also a suggestion to clarify that the macro towers are prohibited in single-family zones, not including adjacent right-of-way. And that's, staff is agreeable to that clarification. Clarity's always good.
Okay, that's just clarity, that's what you had been saying all along, it just wasn't said clearly enough, right?
Right.
Okay, so you're not changing the context, just clarification?
Yeah.
Okay, and then an ask for a decorative pole, I'm not sure where we need that, because we're not talking our poles here, but in general, that probably wouldn't hurt.
I can add that definition.
Definition? Okay. Anything else? If not, I'll sum up something here, if not.
So it sounds to me like we started off with 10 feet. We're talking about the replacement poles again and the pole extensions. We started off with 10 feet and probably heard from the carriers that that wasn't doable because it was just, it was going to create a problem each time because 10 feet isn't sufficient to allow for the clearance that's required. And so then we went to 15 feet. But I'm still interested in whether my fellow committee members are interested in putting in language about, but under no circumstance should it be any taller than X, and I don't know what that should be.
So what that would do, oops. So it's hard to see with this squawk photo, I apologize, but there's actually guy wires and there is a power coming off towards the top of this. So I think what they would say is if PSC is saying it needs to be a maximum of 10 feet from the top of the pole, and we're going to then cap that overall height or to go back to 10 feet, what that would mean is they would need to provide a new, that this pole becomes now not usable for them. They would have to provide a separate pole within the right-of-way that would be a max of, if we keep 30 feet, 30 feet. So that would be probably somewhere around this tall. Because my guess is this is probably closer to 50 feet now.
So I live on Squawk Mountain, and we have some really tall poles with a lot of equipment on them to begin with. And I think, I don't know that somebody would notice if you added one of these small cells, but I think you would notice if you added 15 feet to some of these poles, especially the poles like this one that's right in front of somebody's house. So I'm also in favor of thinking about what a maximum looks like. And maybe if you already have a 50-foot tall pole and it's not the ideal location from the carrier's point of view to put the equipment 60 feet up anyway, maybe we do have some sort of maximum pole so that we don't have these extremely tall poles in certain neighborhoods.
And I hear your thought, I'm going to comment on that because, so like you said, in that situation, a taller pole or an additional pole, if that's the trade-off, I'm not sure which is better. Do we look up and really see the extra height, or do we see the extra pole more, right? Well, I hear what you're saying, and I kind of agree with you, and then I see the other side too, so I'm not sure if it will help us or hurt us. That's my question. Do you think it will help us or hurt us, or help or hurt the companies? I'm not seeing a clear line either way.
Well, I think what we heard was with new poles, the trade-off is, more height or more poles. I'm not sure if it's the same discussion when you're talking about replacing poles and making them taller. I just don't know enough about it. But I am concerned about this 15 feet additional, needing a lot of taller poles.
So that's a number that the carriers gave us. So we believe that if they are going to use these existing utility poles, that they need that much extension. And so I think the choice for you guys, either we live with that 15 feet, or we decide that that extra height is going to cause a visual impact on either views to mountains or whatnot, and we would rather have the additional poles because now they have to set up their own network within these neighborhoods. So, this is the hard thing, and it's the hard thing that because they can't tell us what, at the end of it, what it's going to look like in 10 years from now, that we don't know, are we going to get just a plethora of new poles? And then the other choice that we don't know is it could very well be that by making that decision, they decide they're just going to put another macro on Squawk and not put a bunch of small cells. That's a possibility too, at least in my mind, which may not be in their minds. So this is the thing, is there's a lot of unknowns. From an infrastructure standpoint, we're trying to facilitate the growth of an infrastructure within our community. It's going to have visual impacts, and the decisions we're making affect number of poles, height of poles, and so I think, when I'm old enough to know when the macro facilities came, we thought they were going to be everywhere. And really, it's hard for us to think about where they are. They are spread through our community, but they're really not that invasive to our community. I think most people don't see them and kind of freak out. So I don't know if there's a clear answer on this one. I think we have to pick, and if we picked poorly, we can always, as was said, in a couple years, we can come back and pick a little differently if we feel like we picked wrong.
Ben?
This was a new discussion since we had public comment, and so I'm wondering if there was a possibility for, if anybody has anything specific to this topic that's not been said, maybe give an opportunity to speak to it, whether it's the other two carriers or Connie, because it's the whole extender potential height of the poles is new. We didn't really talk about that.
Okay, I heard you say, I think the company side has answered it for us, I think, pretty well. I got a lot of nods. If Connie wants to speak for the
Sure.
public, maybe you could mention what you think of this conundrum we're in. It's reaching for you, but you don't have to.
Yeah.
That's fine. Don't want to put any pressure on you.
Okay, I'll say what I think, but
Good, please do. I appreciate you stepping up, Connie.
I wondered if there was any
no
other
arm twist, it's just
information.
my legs
of
are
the
straight.
carriers.
It might take me a long time to get to the room. All right. Oh,
Speaking now is Connie, a member at large from the public.
I also live on Squawk, so I am just going to come at it from the Squawk perspective. And we have a lot of poles, but the bigger, taller poles are notable. And the other ones just sort of look like the bottoms of trees. So I would limit the height and make them put on another pole. One question I start asking is, the community also uses a variety of poles. So I don't know if the new poles they put in are also poles that the community can use to string their wires on. And I just never even thought to ask, are they private poles? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Connie. So I have a suggestion. Since what I heard that ideally over 40 feet doesn't help you any in as far as technical coverage, if we leave the 15 foot and put a maximum of 50 foot on there, it keeps us to within something fairly normal, still within the range, and then goes to another pole. But maybe we have some ability to keep getting a 60-foot plus pole in there. Just a thought. Kind of we're working here in front of everybody. So, and Keith, you can respond to that too if you would like.
So the question that Connie asked was, so those poles are not, if they erected a new pole, they would not be owned by the city. They would not be a publicly owned pole. They would be privately owned. The 50 feet, if we're going to cap it at 50 feet, it's probably close. This is probably close to the height of this pole right now, if I was to guess. So, I mean, that's a four-story building, 50 feet. So if that's the scale of the facilities that you want in our neighborhoods. Now, the question is, so just to give you a little bit of a twist on this. So, for example, Verizon's first deployment was on Issaquah Falls City Road. It was not what you'd consider in a neighborhood, and it was on fairly big utility poles. And so I guess if you guys are thinking about that scale issue, is it limited to within single-family neighborhoods so that if they're out on an arterial, do you have that same concern for scale of 50 feet, just as a question? Because we have some big utility poles like on East Lake Sammamish, for example.
And those are usually pretty big, and they probably wouldn't need big extenders. Hopefully, I don't think. No, maybe not. I'm going to turn. Oh, we're going to have to move on here and figure out what we're going to do. So let's each of you tell me what you think, where you're landing, and we'll move on through. Go ahead.
Can I just ask one
Yeah.
follow-up to the Fall City? Did they use extenders on the Fall City? They just put them on the existing poles, right?
Hi, Jennifer Taylor. I'm a consultant for Verizon. I'm working on the East Ridge project. So those poles are actually transmission lines. Most of what we're talking about here are distribution poles, so they are much shorter. With the transmission poles, PSC allows us to go in between the two types of lines. So we're actually above the distribution poles, like we've talked here, but we're below their transmission transmission lines. So we aren't extending those poles, but that's simply because those poles are also already 80 to 100 feet. And then I just wanted to mention a couple things. The section that we're talking about with the 15 feet for pole replacements, that's not specific to small cell. That also includes macros. Macro antennas sometimes are a little bit bigger, and as we've talked about, they also need to be taller. So something to keep in mind if you're looking at changing any of those sections. And for pole heights, there tend to be a lot of variety even within just one neighborhood because of hills and things like that where I'm going to get, I don't know all the technical aspects myself very well, but it has to do with the way that the lines and how much they can hang down. And as you go up and down hills, they change their pole heights so that they can adjust for that. So we can sometimes have poles within a line that are quite different heights. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess I have one more technical question here as I look at this. There's two things. There's Part A and Part C. So I understand, I think I've confused the two. Part C is an extender where they need the 15 feet because they're keeping the pole as is, and because of technical requirements, they need the 15 feet. If they did a replacement pole, we're also saying they can go 15 feet above, and that need for that extra 15 feet, for me, disappears if it's a replacement pole, because you're not on the utility piece where you have to have that clearance. So that might be a difference that we could separate, if that's making some sense. Because everyone, you know, it's on, they have to get above the utility, they need the 15 feet. But if they put the replacement pole, they don't need a whole nother 15 feet, because that requirement is now gone. If I'm reading that right.
No, so for example, let's say, so on this one, the way it reads right now, Councilmember Ramos, is, so let's assume that they want to put a facility here. And they could then choose to either put an extender on top of this, or the pole owner, just because of the structure of the pole, it may not allow for that extension. So they might have to put a replacement pole in. And that replacement pole would be that, so if assuming the power lines are at the same elevation, you know, whether you're putting the extension on or whether you're putting the taller pole in, it's going to have the top of it's going to be at the same place, I think.
I got you. I was just, well, that would go back to a new pole. If they just left that one alone, put a new pole in, it goes to that. Sorry. Yep, I was confused. Thank you.
So I think we seem to be on one issue, and that is whether or not we're going to cap maximum height. And so there's a couple things we can do. One is you have suggested 50. We can go ahead and move forward with 50. You know, I assume this will be coming under regular business. You know, there's an opportunity for us to leave that open for now and to have some conversations with the carriers between now and when the agenda bill comes forward. You know, or we can do some research and come back with ideas at another committee meeting.
I think one piece of information is missing is how, you know, what's our baseline right now? So how tall are these poles? We're all looking at it going, yeah, I think it's 30 or 40 or whatever. I don't have any idea how tall the pole is. And so it'd be nice to know what we're starting with. And so, because if we're already starting with 45 on most of these poles, then going to 50 is not a big deal. But if we're starting with 30, then going to 50 is, I guess you couldn't go to 50 started with 30. But actually you can, because there's also an opportunity in here to show that it needs to be more, I think. It needs to be more. But anyway, so I don't know what these poles are right now. But it's hard to it's hard to make a recommendation and move forward when we don't have all of the information. It's kind of a new issue tonight.
So it is, and I think that's where we're getting hung up a little bit on some technical stuff that don't have quite all the information. So I'd like to take a recommendation here. We haven't, we haven't discussed any of the other issues, so I'm assuming we're fairly good with those, but we'll have to check. But for this issue at least, I think it's a good idea to fix the 15 feet you have to fix. And let's put a piece in there to take this discussion, get a little more information, and when it goes to council, we can have that discussion of the, if there's a limit, and you can gather a little more information, give us an example of some poles that you might show that are 40 feet now, or if we got some 60-foot poles out there now, or whatever. If you have a few of those that might bring the odd situation to note, that would be good. If that works for folks.
Are you suggesting that it goes to the full council with an unresolved issue?
That's one way to do it, with just this one, if we have everything else resolved but the one.
Or
you want to keep it another month?
Well, if there's a recommendation to bring it back to the full council, it wasn't mandated by the council that the committee bring it back. So my question is whether there's a time sensitivity. We probably asked this last month too. I think the carriers would like to be able to move on, and I think we all would like it off our desks, but it's also an opportunity for us to talk at the committee level one more time about this if there's not a huge time sensitivity.
So, what we have now is we don't have coverage, so none of this is in play, right? The only thing that's in code right now is we have franchise rights, but then we also have what's in there now, which is geared only towards macro cells. And so, there's the risk that you have if this comes back is that we could get an application in the next month that would then be vested under existing code. So, I mean, as much as I love coming to committee meetings, I would rather it move out. But if the committee wants it back one more time, what I would say is generally those light standards, you're looking at South Cove, Old Town, and Squawk. Those light standards are all at about 30 feet. And what's different about Squawk is you have the extension on top, whereas Old Town's at the top, and then the Cobra Head in South Cove is not that. So, but, I guess I don't know if you know now that, so if the maximum, if what you're concerned about, like to take the Old Town example, because here's the top of the carport, this is like 30 feet. So if the concern is that by allowing 15 feet, you're at 45 now, and that's still not 50, but that 15 feet is what you're really trying to not allow, then I think you should say that there's just no extension or increase in replacement pole height. Make them put a new pole over here. If it's really getting above a certain height, there's all sorts of issues with every pole, and is it next to a stand of evergreen trees where that extra height just blends in, as Councilmember Ramos said earlier, with the trees, and you just really don't see it? Or is it sticking out now, and the view of Mount Rainier is right back here, and everybody's looking now through a pole extension? So there's some individual characteristics that I think affect probably how the community would react to that extension, depending on where the pole is.
Well, precisely. And so if we move forward and make a recommendation, and we're going to talk about this fully at the council or here, because we have to be able to know for ourselves what is allowed and what's coming. We can't just have unknown expectations, something that's just completely unknown. If somebody says, how tall could those poles be on Squawk Mountain? Well, I'd have to say, well, I don't have any idea because I don't know how tall they are now. So
15 feet taller than they are now is the answer, right?
But how tall is that? I mean, some people want to know how tall is that. I don't think we have to measure every pole. I just don't. Yeah, I think the question is whether we bring it to council and have a committee-like discussion, or whether we bring it back here.
Okay, so let me herd us around a little bit here. So I hear you on that. We're going to get to that. I want to get to one more question before that, is because we've spent all the time on this. Are the other issues as staff recommendations for everything else? No one's brought up any question on those. Are those all okay with staff recommendations other than this one issue? Like, I didn't hear any questions within that. So I'm okay with staff recommendations for everything else too. I'm going with, y'all worked it out, you communicated, you've done the best you can, and I think I'm good with those, right? So we're down basically to 2 paragraphs here and dealing with that. So, I wish we'd done this last month, but we didn't. So I can go with whichever way committee wants to go, whether we hold it here and deal with this one issue next month and then to council. And so it'd be it'd take, basically 3 months to get to council versus 1, but that's okay with me. If the only rush is if somebody comes in the meantime. Other than that, we'd rather get it right. And then get a little work out of you 3 folks and just give us some examples of what's going on some of these areas that have some taller poles and what it would look like. And bring that to us. It sounds like what the information you want.
So the recommendation is to bring it back to the full council by April 16th, which is Monday.
Right, and that's not going to happen. It's not on the schedule. That was the original one before we held it 1 month over. So we'd
Right.
hold it over another month again. So that was the original intent. So I'm hearing from you, it sounds like you want to hold it in committee here another month. All right?
What do you guys want to do?
I thought that the current recommendation was to send it to committee on the April 16th, right?
Full council.
Full council, sorry.
It's not on the agenda now as proposed for the 16th agenda because it was held over a month. That's what the original item was, but that was when it was in the March 15th CIC meeting. We've extended that a month. No one's updated that motion. So that's a month old. So as soon as it could come, and I'd have to check with leadership, would be the first meeting in May, which is the 7th, I think. So it'd be May 7th is the first, if we send it now to council, or it'll come back the first meeting in June, basically. So first meeting in May or first meeting in June. I don't mind keeping it and getting this settled here.
Keith, it sounds like you're recommending that you'd rather it go to the full council so that we
Get
can
it
get
done.
code passed quicker?
So just selfishly, my work load is huge, and all of these things that just kind of keep spooling on. I think that if what the committee wants is to see some diagrams of what those existing poles would look like with the extensions on them, that's easy to do. I think we could do that well in advance of getting to council. But then you're having this conversation at full council. And that's not, I know that's not a preferred choice for y'all. So I am happy to come back in May if that is if that feels good for the committee.
Member Hunt? What do you think?
We had also talked about that if this code includes changes, because this is an evolving, fast-paced technology, it would be possible to make changes to code later. So I think I am in favor of a maximum, but since it is probably a one-line code change, I noticed that there is actually a maximum height on the macro cell, and it just is one line, maximum height 85 feet. It seems like if we wanted to add it, it could be added fairly straightforward, but we would need to do research in between to make that decision. So I think I'm okay with making a recommendation. Okay.
Do we go to council with this little piece to be discussed at full council?
And I like the way Vicki characterized that, with a change that, a one-line change that comes with a recommendation of why that maximum height is recommended. And I don't, like I said, I don't think, well, never mind.
So what, you're done? Mm-hmm. So what I'm hearing is you prepare the information you said you can easily prepare with some, photos or whatever you need to do with the existing poles, what it would look like and so forth. And so we're saying we'll send it to council May 7th with all this recommendation, with this one item, with more information to come, and then the council then can add this or not for a maximum height limitation. Mm-hmm. And we're not doing it now because we don't have quite information to do that we feel comfortable with. With that information, we go that way versus taking another month to do it. I'm comfortable with letting the council do a little bit of work on that and save it a month. And you all get us, so it can be decided very quickly at council, because it'd be very clear what's obvious.
We can do that.
So then would we be making so the motion tonight would be to make a recommendation to move this to the full council with a recommendation to adopt the code as presented, including the changes we talked to tonight, except for one issue, and that is a possible addition of a maximum height.
Correct.
Okay. I make that motion.
Second.
All All right, so
For
we'll
May
vote
7th.
on that
Yeah, for May 7th,
for May 7th,
regular.
regular business.
Yep.
Okay, aye?
Aye.
Got that? Okay. All right. Keith, thank you. And thank you for what you're going to have all prepared for council, so council can see very clearly the dilemma we had and why we moved it forward.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. We got a little in the weeds on that one and took a little while spinning around in circles, but we got somewhere, so good. Next item up is AB 7538, updated water system plan. Just to cap this a little bit, this is the start of this sharing of information. This is going to be here for a while. I think on the thing it says this goes to council like in October. So we've got approximately 6 months of it being here in our committee, and this is the first time of sharing this information, first time we're seeing it. We don't have to get it all straightened tonight. It's really a discussion and sharing of what you're looking at now, and we can start asking questions and getting those things going. So we're not in a rush for a decision on this item. Okay, with that, Mr. York, you're up.
Thank you. So tonight, we're going to introduce you to the draft 2018 water system plan. We have a water system plan that is now getting old. It was developed in 2012 and adopted by the council in 2014. The Washington State Department of Health requires all water systems, including ours, to update the plan at a certain frequency. It used to be 6 years, and that's true with the current plan, so we're getting close to the need to update this per Washington State Department of Health requirements anyway. And also, our system's changed a lot in the last few years, the adoption of the Central Issaquah plan being one key item, the addition of the South Cove water system, over 1,000 connections, is another key change, and also several development agreements have been adopted or modified since 2012. So we've been working over a year on the water system plan. Staff did a lot of work, but we had a consulting assistance on this. So I have Jeff Hansen here tonight to help me with this introductory presentation. Jeff's from HDR Engineering. He's done over 20 of these things, so he certainly knows what he's doing. And so I'm going to turn it over to Jeff here, the presentation. He has a PowerPoint for you that gives you a good overview of what we're doing and why we're doing it.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yep.
Thank you. Welcome.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Bob. So, yeah, just scroll through an agenda of what I'm going to talk about tonight. First, want to describe, why the city is engaged in this water system planning effort. Bob really touched on it, but just a little bit more detail here. Obviously, it's a plan to guide the water utility into the future and to accommodate growth and growth pressures. How should the water utility respond to those kinds of challenges? Also to identify system deficiencies and then how to resolve those deficiencies through capital improvements. So it's an update of the capital improvement program. And also at the end of the day, as Bob mentioned, you're meeting State Department of Health planning requirements. One of the things that you see in a water system plan is a definition of your water utility service area. And this really, in this current plan update, isn't changing much from what was depicted previously. But from the state's perspective, there are two ways to look at a service area. One is your existing retail service area. And that is shown in this, I was going to say tan, but it shows a little bit different in the projector. But obviously, the core of the city. This is your retail service area. This is where you currently provide service and where you are committed to provide service when applications come in. By contrast, the city also has a future service area where you are the designated service provider in the future. And for the city, those are really just a couple small pockets. There's the lakeside area, and then East Cougar Mountain, the PAA, portion of the PAA over there. There are other portions within your future service area, but that are designated as open space and where you really won't be extending utility service to. But that has to be shown as part of your service area. So that's one of the components of a water system plan, is to clearly delineate where you do and what you will be providing water service. Another component of the water system plan is to take a look backwards to recent past to understand how the city has been utilizing water and what do those trends look like. A couple summary snapshots here. The upper chart looks back starting in 2006 up through 2017, and shows the total annual volume of water utilized by the city. You'll see a little bit of fluctuation over that time period, but in recent years, the trend has been increasing, especially with the addition of South Cove. The other thing this chart shows is the fact that you have two sources of supply, your own groundwater wells, as designated by the lower or yellowish green portion of the graph, and then the blue represents your regional supply from Cascade Water Alliance, the purchased water supply. And what you'll note is that over this period of time, the portion provided by your groundwater supply, fairly consistent, fairly constant. And in recent past, the purchases from Cascade increasing to meet the increases in demand, i.e. primarily South Cove most recently. The bottom table summarizes over the past few years just the breakout in water usage by customer class within the city. Obviously, predominantly residential and commercial in use. The table reflects the fact that about 35% of overall demand is single-family residential, about 20% multifamily, and on down the line. Just to show you kind of the breakout of how the city is utilizing water. When we look at historical information, we want to drill in and understand in more detail water usage characteristics for each of your customer classes on a per account type basis, how much water is being used. What this table shows in one column here, this middle column, is a summary of actual city data, 2014 through 2016, okay? And so, for example, with single-family residences on a per-home basis, in that time period, on average, city is using 145 gallons per day for a single-family home. By contrast, in a multifamily residential complex per unit, that usage is 84 gallons per day. Okay, that's what we see. And then we have a different metric for commercial usage. We look at that by building size, by square footage. So we've got that number there. This column to the right represents or shows numbers of the values that we actually used when we projected future water demand. And we're using different numbers than what we've seen in the recent past. Primary reason is when we do demand projections, if anything, we want to be conservative. We want to hedge a little bit higher because these numbers are going to be important when we're looking at supply capacities. And we want to ensure the city has enough supply to meet future demands. So for example, for single-family residences, the planning value used in the demand forecast, we're using 150 gallons per day per home as compared to the 145 that we've seen. These numbers are consistent with what you've used in the past, and again, they're a little bit higher, a little bit conservative in that sense. This table also shows peaking factors. By peaking, we mean the ratio of water used on the maximum day in the summer versus just the average throughout the course of the year. Past few years, the city has had a peaking factor of just under 2. And so peak use in the summer is about double what it is on the average. For planning into the future, for new demands coming online, we're using a slightly higher number, 2.11. That looks at a longer historical period over the past 10 years. And again, the point here is we're being a little bit conservative. And all of these values are in alignment with other typical utilities in the Puget Sound region. When we look to the future, we look to what the city is planning for, some of those key assumptions that we have with respect to growth. One key one, Central Issaquah plan. We're tracking with commercial and residential growth as outlined in that plan, and I've just kind of summarized some of the key points here. This plan is a 20-year plan. It looks out 20 years into the future, and so with respect to the Central Issaquah plan, the commercial growth that's envisioned in that plan will extend beyond that 20-year period out to the 2060s, but we're recognizing that about a third of that growth will occur within the 20-year period, the coming 20-year period. In terms of residential growth, we're assuming 70% will occur by 2031 and full build out within the 20-year planning horizon of the water system plan. Other areas of the city, growth is driven by specific development agreements by area, and in other areas where there are not specific developer agreements, but yet growth is occurring, city planning is using a general growth rate of 1.6% growth per year. So again, really just indicating that we're utilizing existing growth assumptions that the city's already previously developed. So where does this all lead? This leads to what we call a water demand forecast, projecting future water needs of the city. And here you'll see two lines on this chart. The lower blue line is average day demand, and then the higher red line is that peak day demand. We also call that maximum day demand. Again, maximum use in the summer, about double the average day demand. The dots on the left represent actual historical usage, and then the solid lines are the projected demands into the future. And so what you'll see on the average day demand line, for example, we're showing demands growing from about 2.6 million gallons per day in 2018 up to, out at the 20-year period, 4.5 MGD in 2037. So that kind of growth on an average day basis. These demands are important because one of the key things we do in the water system in the plan is we compare those forecasted demands against your existing water supplies. And we look to see what kind of capacity you have to meet those future demands. Again, you have two sources of supply. You have your own groundwater wells. You have the regional supply from Cascade. The bottom line message on supply is your existing supply capacity is sufficient to meet your total system demands over the 20-year planning period. Yes.
No question. So, I mean, as you stated, our own groundwater is basically fixed, right?
Right.
We've got that. That's fixed. So, all growth means we're reliant on buying water from a regional supplier that we're going to know that they're going to handle all the growth for everywhere. They're going to have growth all around and be able to handle that additional supply. Question, because we're saying we're just expecting them to do that, it sounds like.
Looks like Sheldon wants to tie in here in just a minute, but let me first respond by saying, yeah, you have a little bit of additional well supply that can be utilized, and I'll demonstrate that in the next slide. So you're not completely maxed out yet, but you are close. And then yes, currently your current supply portfolio would say that Cascade is there to meet that balance of that demand. And through the agreement that you have with Cascade, they are committed to providing you a full supply. So contractually, that exists, and they are the ones to provide that supply. Did you want to add on to that at all, or?
Oh, that's exactly what I was going to say.
Oh, okay, all right. So, okay. This next chart helps explain this a little bit. So the previous slide said, for your system as a whole, your existing supplies are sufficient to meet future demands. As you likely know, the city's area is divided into various operating areas, right? And your groundwater wells are providing certain portions of the city, and Cascade Regional Water is providing other portions of the city. So for example, currently Cascade Water is going to the Highlands, right? Groundwater, your own groundwater supply is feeding the majority of the valley zone. And so what we wanted to do was to look at how long can groundwater supply continue to meet the needs of the valley zone? And that's what this chart depicts. So the bars, the vertical bars, represent demand within the areas that are currently fed by groundwater supply. So it's not your total system demand, it's just the parts of the city that are getting groundwater. The red horizontal line is your current groundwater well pumping capacity. All right? By contrast, and just for information, I have shown up here this blue line. These are your water rights associated with the wells. So that's the amount of water on paper that the state has said you can withdraw from the wells. You don't have pumping capacity currently to withdraw all of that water. So one of the key questions that we look at is comparing this red line with the demand. And the demand is broken into two different portions here. One, the lower part of each of these bars are the demand in the valley outside of the talus area. And then the talus demands are the hatched area on top, okay? What this chart demonstrates is that based on the demand forecast, by 2021, the demands in the areas of the city currently served by groundwater will exceed your groundwater well pumping capacity. So that starting in 2021, additional supply would be needed in the valley area. Now, we've also shown if talus was taken off of groundwater, like if talus was converted, for example, to Cascade Regional Supply, how much longer would it take for growth in the rest of the valley to then meet that threshold of your existing well capacities? And that goes out to 2025, okay? So again, bottom line here is overall system-wide, you have sufficient capacity. But when we drill in to look at where you're currently served with groundwater, there are limitations, and they're coming up in the near future, certainly within the next 10-year planning period. Questions on that before I move on? Okay.
Well, yeah, you took talus out just to show the difference because why?
We did that.
We have to pump up to the tanks or what?
Right, we showed that because the way the city provides water to talus, that area can be segregated from the rest.
Because we got to pump it up and.
Because you have to pump, right. And as you may recall, talus has received regional cascade water in the past due to the landslide issue. But now talus is back on groundwater supply, as I understand, for the past month or so. And so this is assuming that it stays on groundwater, but we're just exploring if it were to be taken off of groundwater, this is what would result. Okay. This is one of the key portions of the plan because it's identifying a potential need to address service to that area, and it might have an implication with supply. Another key portion of the water system plan is looking at long-term groundwater treatment. So, you currently have two groundwater treatment or well field areas, the Risden wells and the Gilman wells. Treatment is provided at both of those to address various water quality requirements. Looking long-term, there's just continued challenges that will need to be addressed at both of those well field sites. The plan considered various options for addressing those challenges. The recommendation is to move forward with a centralized treatment facility, which would bring groundwater from both those well field sites to one centralized location to provide treatment to address these issues that are listed here. Manganese, arsenic, ammonia, low pH, the perfluoro substances that you've been dealing with, PFOS and PFOA at well number 4. This also then supports then looking at blending of groundwater with Cascade Regional Water in the valley area. And doing it at one site would then support blending of those supplies. So another key aspect of the plan. Another part of the plan is to look at other various facilities throughout the water utility. As you know, you pump, you've got booster pump stations, you've got reservoirs, and obviously distribution system piping. The take-home message with respect to all of these facilities are that your facilities have sufficient capacity. That's the first thing that we look at into the future. Planned improvements include routine pump station upgrades, normal rehab and upgrades to those facilities, routine pipe replacements, replacement of old asbestos cement piping, upgrades to meet fire flow requirements. There's one new storage facility that is contemplated in the plan. It's the new Spar Reservoir within the next 10 years to accommodate growth, again, within the central Issaquah, the Valley area. All of this then leads to the updated capital improvement plan, or CIP, that is outlined, again, for the full 20-year period. We break it up into 2 10-year allotments. So you've got the coming 10 years and then the further in the future 10 years. You can see the numbers broken out here by different project categories, distribution piping projects versus pump stations, storage, and then water supply and treatment. Bottom line, what we are projecting in the CIP over the coming 20 years is approximately $60 million in capital improvements for the water utility. A large portion of that is associated with the envisioned new treatment facility to address those water quality issues that I mentioned previously. Having developed the CIP, we then do not a full rate study, but a quick kind of overview look of the water utility finances to understand the ability of projected revenue to meet capital and operational outlays. The bottom line message on the financial program evaluation is that rate adjustments and/or other additional revenue sources will be necessary to meet that coming capital need into the future. Those key drivers in the financial plan are the projection of continued and additional purchase costs of regional water from Cascade and the funding of that proposed CIP that I summarized earlier, including the water treatment plant. Now, I've really just hit kind of the key points of the water plan. There are, though, other components of the water system plan. This includes documentation of water utility policies and design criteria. There's really nothing new in this plan update with respect to those items. Those have been really carried forward from the prior plan. Your water use efficiency program is described in the water system plan by state law. You are required to have a conservation program, and you are required to periodically review and update your water use efficiency goals. And we're not talking about that in detail tonight, but when this comes back around to council on May 7th, I believe, that's when we will also be having a public hearing component of that meeting to address the water use efficiency goals. In summary, for the city, since you are a partner and a member of Cascade Water Alliance, Cascade has their regional water use efficiency program. You participate in that, and that really outlines your program. The water system plan also documents your compliance with state and federal water quality requirements. It also provides a description of your operations and maintenance program. And there's a whole host of appendices that relate to, again, just the operation of the water utility. So those are really the highlights that we wanted to hit on today. As was mentioned earlier, this is just your first entree to it. We're going to be coming back in May with a more focused discussion on water use efficiency. However, the next steps that are going to be occurring, now we will be launching into the external review phase of water system planning. And so the idea here is that after tonight, this plan is ready, if you are ready, for it to go through external review. That's through the State Department of Health, King County, adjacent purveyors, et cetera. And so staff are poised to launch on that effort even as early as next week to distribute that plan for external review. Yeah.
Yeah, this doesn't line up with, we're talking about council approval in the summer when it's not going back to council till November. So how can the council approve it in summertime?
So the typical process is that, so you send out a plan for external review without having approved it because you want to see what kind of comments the state and the county come back with. This is quite a process.
And that's in April till June.
And that's April through June. Response to comments in the summertime, July timeframe. Finalize the document, come back to council then for approval, once you understand what the
Committee.
external.
Come back to committee.
Come back to committee. My
There we go.
apologies, yes. Come back to committee for discussion on that, and then recommend to go to council for approval.
All right, I'm okay now.
Does that clarify? Yeah. This is a process the state will take, they have up to 90 days for their review. Recently, it's been a little bit quicker than that, but 60 to 90 days for review, and so that's part of that process. So with that, that really concludes what we wanted to discuss tonight, but I'm open to any questions or other discussion.
Questions? No?
I have one, I think it's more for the city. Maybe you can answer it, I'm not sure. And that also, it was asked also by a member of the public, but it's also a question I had, which is about the fluoridated water and having a public conversation about fluoridation of water. Some neighborhoods in Issaquah currently do have fluoridated water, some do not, and it seems like with the development of the water system plan, that is a good context to have the conversation, so I just wanted your thoughts on the best way to do that.
Sure. I can give you the quick answer to that, and then Sheldon or Bob can weigh in on that as well. So in the water system plan, yes, this concept of long-term centralized treatment and then ultimately blending of regional and groundwater to introduce regional water to areas that currently haven't seen it. Fluoridation is a question that does need to be discussed. It's not resolved within the context of the water system plan because what the water system plan has done is tee up that issue, and now the city is moving into the planning and design efforts related to treatment, and that's where that conversation will be held. And so we're currently working with the city. We're scoping the first elements of those planning steps, which will be occurring late spring and into the summer. And as a part of that, that's where there will be opportunity for public input and dialogue around the fluoridation issue.
So to add a little bit more to that, what Jeff said was exactly right. The water system plan doesn't resolve that policy issue. What it does is it tees up that conversation as part of the water treatment plant project. When that project gets funded, studies will have to be done on water quality, blending, and things like that. And then as information comes available on what are the different options on how to address fluoridation, be it keep the water fluoridated or remove the fluoride, or some sections of the city still receive fluoridated and others don't. There's discussion to be had there amongst the community as part of that treatment plant and the development of the adjustments in the system hydraulics to be able to address the blending and ensure supply is met citywide. So that's really the project. It's a very specific project where that conversation happens.
So maybe you can give a little more background on currently what water is fluoridated, what water isn't, where is that's happening, to just give us a baseline right now.
Right, so the bottom line is that the regional supply from Cascade is fluoridated. Your groundwater supply is not, that is going into areas that currently receive only groundwater. So the valley area, and so it does not include fluoride right now.
With one exception, Talus.
Yes, right.
For consistency of water quality delivered to Talus, since they've received regional water in the past, they continue to receive fluoridated water because we have a fluoridation station at the pump stations that go up the hill so that we can take the groundwater, fluoridate it, and only service Talus with that fluoridated water.
Thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions? If not, public comment? And I know somebody has something to say.
So I'm going to start by saying I like the report. I thought the report was nice and clear. I sent you all an email because if I were sitting there, I'd be saying, well, where can we impact this? Why are we looking at this and what can we change? And so that's my biggest question. What are the policy decisions in this? I look at their assumptions of water use, and I think that their assumptions are more than conservative in some areas. I think they're downright aggressive in the multifamily area. That's a pretty hefty up. We are getting less lawn and tighter, smaller areas that should be using less water as we grow. So I would like to see the data that would correspond to the water uses of urbanizing areas, because when you're in a stacked flat, you don't use the same amount of water as if you're in, Montreux. So sort of the compliments and the questions, and now comes the tirade. Because we were promised as a community that we would never blend water. And this was back when the Issaquah Highlands was getting their water source, and we were dealing with Cascade water coming on as a supply. And so they said, you don't have to worry about it. You people here, you're going to have the same great water. Okay, well, then we had the Central Issaquah Plan, and we said, what about the water supply? How much is that going to cost? How much is it going to cost the community to grow to this pace? And they said, later, mañana. It should be fine. But when you look at their numbers and you look at the impact on the current residents in the community having to look at potential rate increases to pay for the growth that y'all said wasn't going to be a problem, people can barely stay in their homes now. So if you start using rate increases to fund growth for infrastructure, I just am morally opposed. That's growing on the backs of the existing community. So one, you want to blend our water, which you said you weren't going to do. You want to help us pay for that charming adventure. And what I would like to see before you go that way, because you may have to go that way, I understand that, I'm not that silly. I want to understand how we can use less water, how we can create a community that is based on reducing the water so we don't have to do these things as quickly. Where are our conservation goals? Where is our Department of Sustainability in this conversation, and where are those policies in this plan? Not just saying we use the same plan as they require. What do we do in Issaquah? Because Issaquah is a place that values our aquifer so much. Not everybody is on an aquifer like we are. So what do we do to preserve that and reduce our quality? Our usage of our groundwater. The financial differences between maintaining our own groundwater at X level and use Cascade water at X time. What are the cost savings that we get, right? So if we conserve water, how much does that save us in Cascade? Is Cascade a tiered structure? I remember tiers from long ago, but I don't remember what those tiers are. And that is part of the decision-making tools that I don't see you having when you're looking at the policies and the impacts of this conversation. They say, oh, the fluoridation, that's down the road. I'm sorry, that's a little bit pregnant. You've already decided that you're going to be doing this treatment plant by the time you get to what kind of treatment plant it is, and you've also already worked in the timeline. So I think the time for that conversation is now, and I would say we want to have that conversation before you send it out to anyone else, because we don't want it pinging and ponging back and forth to them if if you change basic assumptions. Okay, I think I'm done.
Thank you. All right. Any other further discussion desired this evening?
When is it coming back to us? When is this coming back to us? And are there, what are so Connie's comment about what's our opportunity to affect any change to this document? And is our Issaquah specific information or in this document that, not just what the state requires, but, so what's the council's role here? Just to,
The council's roles are related to the policy elements within the plan. Some of what Ms. Marsh spoke about are dealing with the efficiency goals, which is a very specific policy area that the council can weigh in on, and which that is the major topic of the public hearing also on May 7 in front of the full council as part of this process to get the water system plan completed. And with that, the council can say the goals should be X or Y or whatever the goals they desire to have, and then develop a plan to ensure that those goals are met.
Shelby, do we have is there a list of policy questions somewhere specific rather than us digging through the plan to find them?
No, but we can generate the policy questions very specifically for you related to that. And then the process as far as when does the plan come back to you, it's going to stay here in the committee as discussions occur and we receive comments from adjoining agencies, DOH, county, so that you guys get to hear all the comments also from the other entities that are interested in the water system planning of Issaquah, not just the group that you're hearing from today.
Okay. Well, I would like a list of, a comprehensive list of policy issues back at the next time we see this.
We can prepare that.
I would also like that, and I think that Councilmember Goodman articulated it very well. I would also like information about cost implications of different policy decisions. I think that there is some information about the cost implications in the document, but it wasn't very clear to me what the role of our decision-making, how that would impact those cost options, and so that would also be helpful. Basically, cost implications of the policy options that we have.
Okay, and I'd like to, excuse me, add to that is a more specific timeline with steps in it. Like you say November, but a public hearing in May 7th, that was just kind of slipped out here. What all the steps along the way till November or whatever, and what's going to happen when. So, timeline on that. And I guess you said basically cost implications on a lot of that. You said the majority of the cost is treatment plant of some sort. So are there other options, other ways to deal with that? I hate to see only be presented with one option. I like the word option actually says, makes me feel like there's more than one. So what are options, particularly in those big cost items that you're seeing in the next 20-something years of being absorbed? $60 million is not an easily absorbed amount in the next 20 years, in my mind. So how can we look at that big number? Are we good on this for now? Well, thank you very much. It's a good start. We'll be seeing you, I imagine, again, and we'll go from here. All right, excellent. We have a couple more items, and And they're scheduled for, at least an hour or so more. So, just because I can. No, all right, we'll go on. So next item is Gilman Boulevard project update. I'm going to have you wait 2 minutes before you start, though.
No problem.
Yes. So, Brianne Ross, Senior Transportation Engineer for Public Works Engineering, and I'm the project manager for our Gilman Boulevard project. And I wanted to come to you tonight to give a quick update. We're kicking off our project and we're going to start to go out to the public. So I wanted to make sure you guys were informed about what we've got going on. So our Gilman project goes from SR 900 to Front Street. And we just had our internal kickoff meeting not too long ago, where we discussed project goals, the good things that work about Gilman with now, the things that could use some improvement on Gilman now, opportunities that we see that maybe are underutilized, and also how to go forward with community engagement. So these is all the background information that our consultant is currently using to create a survey that we're going to put out to the public shortly. So this is our kickoff meeting, and at that meeting, staff identified these goals and had a good conversation, namely about maintaining our current economic vitality. We have a unique situation where the Gilman is economically successful. A lot of times when you go forward to do a project like this, you're looking to revitalize an area like that. And so that's something that we want to make sure that we maintain going forward and looking at how to do that. Another issue that we discussed is the green necklace work, which is going to land in Shore this month, and how to continue to integrate parks and that work into the Gilman project. So this project is necessary because currently we have bike lanes that stop in the middle of the corridor. It's not a very pedestrian-friendly environment, and we have a higher number of vehicle conflicts along the corridor. There's also no standard cross-section applied to Gilman, so when developers come in, we don't have a way to tell them exactly what they should be building. So that's what this project is going to address. So over the next year or so, we are going to develop a corridor framework. We have already done our project scope and approval. We looked at project objectives at that kickoff meeting, and now we're currently analyzing all the existing conditions, looking at all the existing reports that we have out there and how they can impact Gilman, and developing the online survey. That survey will go out to the public, and we'll also meet with business property owners and general public, and create a corridor framework. This is another way to see that. The corridor framework is what's going to identify the higher level wants for this corridor. So it's not going to get into the details of, is this 5 feet or 6 feet wide? It's, we want a wide sidewalk, or we want enhanced bike facilities, or, you know, those types of descriptions. And so that's what we will have at the end of this process. Next year, we would look at getting into those details and providing a concept. We also are looking at forming our project ambassadors. So those are folks that we want to help us communicate out to the public. And so we want them to represent a wide variety of groups, both property owners, business owners, residents, bike advocates. So trying to span a wide variety of people that can help us get the word out, to have people fill out the survey, help us get information back from them, and also attend the workshops and help get other people to come to the workshops so we can get a broader range of opinions. And that's all.
Thank you. Discussion. Questions? Should say. Sorry.
Thank you for the presentation. I had a question. I have two questions. One is about the PDF, the image, which I believe was the image that was made with the community input, that one. So that's the same, right, in our packet that was on this? Okay.
Yeah, that's the same. And that was not with the community yet. We haven't reached out to the community yet. That was all internal staff. So we had members from every department, including fire, police, et cetera, talking about Gilman.
Okay. So I was reading this, and I think it has a lot of really interesting ideas in it, and I was wondering if it would be possible to get a higher quality PDF, because it's just a little bit hard to read some of the handwriting in there.
So the best PDF that we have is online on our website. But being that it was a really large scroll and got scanned in, because it was written in by hand, not generated by computer, that's the best that we have. So I'm not sure if you looked at the link on our website, but that hopefully is better than shrunken down into PowerPoint.
Okay, that's great to know, so I will do that. And then my other question was about the importance of the cross-section. You mentioned that Gilman doesn't have a consistent cross-section, and that has to then, that informs what developers do. I wonder if you could expand on that, because I wasn't clear on that.
Yeah, so when the Central Issaquah Plan was created, they identified cross-sections, basically how many lanes are each road, how wide is the sidewalk, how wide is planter strip, where do we have center medians, where do we not, all of those elements being identified in the Central Issaquah Plan. When they looked at Gilman, they decided that that was a bigger effort and that should have more focus and attention put towards it. And so they said to be determined at a future date. So now as developers come in, it's been matching existing with the exemption of, adding some standards of planter strip and sidewalk. But we want to look at Gilman. We have a fairly wide public right-of-way there, and how can we fully utilize our current right-of-way? And also with the Green Necklace work, they're looking at a linear park on that, in that corridor. So how can we incorporate that as well?
And part of Gilman is outside of the Central Issaquah, and I believe, no?
I think it's entire.
I think the entire length is within the Central Issaquah from front to 900, which is the limits of this project.
Okay, yeah, because we had talked about, in planning policy, we had talked about, I think it must be the other end of.
Right, you spoke about the northeast end, yeah.
The questions? Okay, I'll give a chance for public comment, if anything, at this point.
So I'm happy. All the stuff was on the website. It was easy to see. So similar to the last conversation, one end product I would like to see is a list of policy questions for council, because to me, Gilman needs to slow down and let people cross it, potentially even get narrower. And so I think there's going to be a push-pull between getting cars through and making it finally sort of a commercial area where people can walk around. And I think council is going to have to weigh in on those kinds of decisions. So I think it would be wise to have some, the vision of where's council going to have to say what. Okay, and then in the meantime, before the Gilman study is done, we have things going on Gilman that might impact the right-of-way or could create a great park. And I am unclear as to how ongoing development of Gilman is going to work when we're in the middle of creating a plan, because it's super awkward to get development happening and then come afterward with its overarching plan. So if y'all can think about how to resolve that problem, because it's giving me fits.
Thank you. My thought is just to comment is the schedule you have up there is this will be concluded the end of this calendar year. Right? So, yeah, and that's the process there, and just kind of highlight that so people kind of get an idea on the flow and when it's happening.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's it?
I just think it's, your presentation was great, and it's great so far. Yep, again, pounded home, every meeting, every item, policy questions. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, and I'm glad we're doing this, and I'm glad we extended it for the whole stretch and not stopped it partway as originally thought. So this is going to get us, I think, one of the places we want to go. So thank you. That item concluded. You're up for the next item as well, and so you pull up your next PowerPoint there. Thank you, Brianne.
Okay, so next.
And that is, excuse me, and then grant applications, and we're talking about Newport, 54th to 900, and Maple to Sunset. What we're talking about here.
Correct. So Newport Way, Maple to Sunset. John Mortensen is actually our project engineer for this project, but he is out today, so you get me. So purpose of this presentation is to inform you about some items that are coming forward on the agenda for April 16th, namely that we have a grant application that we would like to apply for. And so we're requesting authorization from council to do so. So we're going to go over a super brief project history. This should be a little bit of a review. I did something similar to this in December, but just getting everyone familiar with the project because it is coming back to life. So there is some history to this project. Back in 2009, 2010, a concept was developed and adopted by council. We used that concept to apply for this exact same grant, this PSRC grant, back in 2016. We were awarded that grant for design, and we are now just starting our design process again. So we know that since 2010, some things have changed. We have a potential middle school coming in. We have a change in local regional traffic, and then there's also some additional developments that are coming in on the corridor that can be impacting how that operates. So we are going to take another look. First order of business is going to be to do some traffic modeling and look at the design that will either confirm that the concept that was previously adopted by council will be moving forward, or that we need to potentially reevaluate some of these traffic impact decisions, like the lane configuration where center medians might be located and intersection controls. Things that we're not anticipating to change at all would be the multimodal elements. We still place a high importance on this corridor to bike facilities and the sidewalk, pedestrian facilities. This is actually the cross-section that was used for the grant application 2 years ago. This is what we're currently working with until we are able to get traffic modeling and look at it, start to get design done. So the current call for projects for PSRC will distribute about $19 million throughout King County in 2021 and 2022. You'll notice that we now have to apply for that money now. So that's why we're looking at applying for construction funds, because at the time that the money will be available to the city to use, we anticipate we'll be ready for construction on this project. We also think that this project could be a candidate for a TIB grant application in the future as well. So the current request in front of you, or that will be in front of you on Monday, is to authorize the city to apply for the PSRC STP grant. There's a maximum of $4.7 million per grant request, and there's a 13.5% match requirement. We'd be looking to apply for that maximum, which would then commit the city to a local match of $600,000. And in addition to that, the phases must be fully funded when the city accepts the award of the grant. And so as a result, this project is one that we are looking at phasing construction of. So we are going to apply for a grant for this project from Maple to Juniper. If situations change where, say, we have some developers that come in on that section and build some of that roadway, we could still use the funds that were awarded to extend that project limit. So going forward, our current estimates assume that no developers will be building any improvements, but we certainly see a possibility where we will have some developers that will build improvements, in which case we could look at combining some of these phases. The other way that we could look at combining phases is if we were successful with other grants. So the idea is that we would try and maximize our availability for grants and minimize the city cost on this project. This project, as we mentioned, is in the early design phase. So this is how we've broken it up to try and take advantage of the connectivity that is typically required with grant applications. They don't like to see facilities end without connection. So that's why this project is unique in the sense that we do have those strong cross streets that we can break that up and still have successful grant applications. So this is the development activity that we're currently aware of. So as some of those items may change, that could potentially extend project limits. So as I mentioned earlier, we've already been awarded $1.8 million from PSRC towards the design of this project. That commits us to designing the entire project. So we will be designing from Maple to Sunset in its entirety. And then it will look at phasing for right-of-way and construction. This project also has $1.6 million as repurposed federal earmark funds. So, due to time sensitivity of grant applications in general, we're looking for authorization at the regular council meeting on April 16th. The motion in front of you will be to authorize the submittal of the grant application, and then should the grant be awarded, and this would be, the agenda bill would be then revised. It comes back to council for council acceptance. At that point, council then has to guarantee that we will fully fund that construction phase.
There's someone else to add, Joe?
Just one little piece to add to that. The agenda bill is currently on the council agenda, on the consent agenda. for authorization to submit the grant application.
Go ahead.
And the reason for that is because this is already in our plans. We've been planning to do it. I mean, we have some criteria that we look at for putting grant applications on consent. Can you tell us the reasons for that?
That's correct. The reason why it's on consent is because it's consistent with the capital plan that you guys have adopted, and it's part of the funding strategy for the project, which is an already ongoing project which the city is moving forward with other funds.
Another question. So on the south end of the project, we heard a lot of comment over the past couple of years about making a lane adding a lane. So I don't have the cross section, but I think it's 2 lanes and then it narrows down to 1. So as you're going through the actual design, what are your thoughts about opportunity to add a lane all the way through?
Yeah, so the current design has 2 southbound lanes to just past Holly Street, and that was based on the traffic model that was done at that time. So as going forward, revitalizing that traffic model and looking forward, we would look to determine if that's still the appropriate ending point for that lane or not.
Okay, so you are going to relook at that?
That's going to be reevaluated, yes.
Thanks. And then this is, I guess this is just for submitting the grant, but when would we get a timeline back to us about, sorry, it's getting late, about how the design process, what's the council's involvement, the public's involvement in the design process? Where's that? That's probably not part of this presentation, right?
Correct.
But it might be something that we would like to see at a near future meeting.
Yeah.
We can bring that back at a future time.
Okay.
And I agree, as I brought that up many times, I think that needs to be relooked at as we are with all these changes, but that is a big personal concern of mine that that design is not valid as it was back then. So I want to keep up with that. And that was a request I had when council first approved that, going ahead with the design. Concern I had. So I'll continue to follow up on that.
A ton of people have had that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the design contract with the consultant was just signed, like in the last couple of weeks, getting all of that processed. So they really are just kicking off and getting started.
Okay.
So I will talk to John about bringing that back.
Then one last question.
Go ahead.
Just because we typically don't like to have things come to the council without referral to committee, even though I realize that this is a pretty, it's already in our plans to do this, but why the time sensitivity? Because it would seem to me that we know when the grant process application, I mean, do we not know far enough in advance that we can have more than one touch on this?
So we have about a month to apply for the grant total.
That's it?
Yeah, so that's where it's something that we've been tracking. We knew that, or we were looking for it to be upcoming, but without the call for projects open, we're unsure of the details, like what's the maximum grant we can apply for. That's new for this year.
Okay.
So without having those details, we don't feel comfortable bringing forward specific requests without those financial details.
Okay, thanks.
And that's a PSRC dependent thing.
And that's typical for a
federal
lot of
funding,
grants,
and
is that you really typically only have 1 or 2 months to apply for the grant. So by the time we have a chance to pull together what we think the application is, we run out of time to bring it to you with more than one touch.
Thanks.
Yep. I had a couple quick questions. I just want to restate what the question here is: applying for a grant, and applying for that grant is simply stated in the grant would be 4-point-something million.
4.76.
4.7 application, and then the matching for the city requirement is a little over $600,000.
Correct.
So that's the details of what we're really talking about now here for just the grant application. I'd like to go back and.
And just a reminder that that's a application for construction funding,
Right.
in which the match money wouldn't have to come available until late 2020 or early 2021.
Thank you for that clarification. And I'd like to go back to the grant ones you had. Let's see, because you mentioned quickly a couple other things, and you said it, and I couldn't hear the words. So I know we have the current design grant, and you said that's for like 1.6 million, but I didn't see 1.6 million up there, so I got confused.
1.8 million. That 1.816500 is,
I don't see 1.8.
it's split between 2018, 2019.
Okay, gotcha. All right, so that's the, all right, so there's a grant fund, and then our matching for that,
Correct, is that mitigation street money?
okay, is the 283?
Correct.
Okay, and then you said there's another grant.
So the 3.6 million that's shown up there is leftover money from the federal bypass. That was earmark money that WashDOT notified us that we could move to a select number of projects that qualified, and this was one of them. So we have repurposed that money towards this project.
Right, thank you for reminding. I remember that now, and but it is in the 2020, so that will be in the construction phase, not the...
That could potentially be used for right-of-way, and if we have enough to get into construction.
Okay, so it's not in any of the design phase, that's in the construction or right-of-way purchase phase at 3.6 million.
I believe that we're using some of it to finalize right-of-way, or finalize design as well. So finalizing design
Yes,
and getting into right-of-way.
okay, great, thank you for that clarification. No other questions? Okay. With that, thank you for that update, and understand, I guess I have just a question to y'all. It's on consent for next Monday, and everybody's okay with that? Okay, just want to make sure. And thank you for, even though it wasn't referred here, they brought it here so we could at least have a touch on it, even though it wasn't an official touch. I appreciate that, considering the time frame. So doing the best we can and still got it here before that. So that's appreciated. Okay, with that done, I believe our...
With it going to council ever, can you probably talk?
Yes, come on. Sorry.
That's a really abbreviated public process. Okay.
I'm a little curious about, in grant writing, if you can write in flexibility to, for changes in the project, because I am going to pummel endlessly to try to get it all the way through SR 900 and down to Front Street, which is actually what the whole corridor is and has even stronger endpoints than the segments that you're talking about now. Because right now you're ending at Sunset when a lot of the problem is going down to Front Street. And we know we have new construction and issues happening all the way through SR 900. So I don't believe you're dealing with the entire corridor. So you'll hear me at every meeting saying that exact same thing. So in case I get somewhere, I'm wondering if you can add flexibility into your grant language to make it easier to be able to extend the ends should anyone desire to.
Thank you. See no one else in the audience. I think that ends public comment. All right. Thank you very much, Rhiannon, for both those. Sheldon, you're up with project updates.
Wow, one more.
Oh, wait. Oh, yeah, one more. Sorry.
One more.
I missed something?
Yeah, maybe. It's combined the same item.
Oh,
Same
yes,
item.
sorry, it's two items, yes.
But this is
I'm
the
sorry,
other
my
project.
fault.
That's okay. So again, here to talk to you about some agenda bills that are on consent for for the regular council on April 16th. There are 3 agenda bills we'll talk about. Due to late hour, we are going to fly through this. We have had 5 public meetings, about 8 council presentations, and council adopted a concept in December. That concept is implementing this vision. And we have this project schedule where, again, we are about 2.5, 3 years away from construction due to environmental permitting and right-of-way acquisition. And therefore, we are again applying for PSRC construction funds now. And there is also a WSDOT call for projects currently out that we would apply for design funds. This project was also awarded the PSRC Transportation Alternatives Program funding, and so that was ordered towards design. We would look at trying to apply for that same grant for construction as well in the future. So, first, the first agenda bill is to ask council to authorize the acceptance of the PSRC Transportation Alternatives Grant. We applied for $2.5 million and were awarded $1.5 million. It requires a match of 13.5%, and the city must fully commit to funding the design phase of the project. We are also, at this point, applying to the WSDOT Pedestrian Bike Grant. Both of these grants focus on our pedestrian and bicycle improvements, and being that it's the Mountains to Sound Greenway Trail, I think that's what led towards our success the first time around and what we're going to continue to enhance in our applications going forward. We're looking to have $1 million to complete the design. That's the amount of money that is allowed by this grant, which is the design, towards the design of bicycle and pedestrian facilities only. It doesn't go towards design of left turn lanes. And it's also the amount of money that we think we would actually be spending once the funds were available in July of 2019. So the finance director has reviewed and approved both the grant acceptance as well as the grant application. And this is what our current design funding looks like.
Go back.
So the third agenda bill is regarding the PSRC grant application for construction. This is the same grant the same grant that we are applying for with the Maple to Sunset project. Same rules apply. Again, we're looking for authorization on April 16th. And if accepted, the two grant applications agenda bills would return to council requesting authorization of grant acceptance. These are the motions that are going to be in front of council on the 16th with 3 separate agenda bills. Authorizing the acceptance of the PSRC TAP grant funds for design and authorizing the submittal of the 2 grant applications.
These all relate to the same project?
Correct.
54 to 900?
Correct.
Yep.
Okay. Questions?
Nope.
And this is just applying for grants?
And accepting.
Acceptance, excuse me. Yeah, the acceptance of 1 and submittal of 2 more.
Correct.
All right. So, all good?
Sort of process question about, it looks like you apply for exactly the amount that you expect to need, is that correct?
So for the WSDOT pedestrian bike grant, that's true, yes. For the PSRC construction grant. We're applying for the maximum amount allowable. For the grant that we're accepting from PSRC for design, we applied for 2.5 million, but we were the last project on the list to be funded, so we got the remaining funds available. They called us and said, we can't give you 2.5, we can give you 1.5. Will you take it? We said yes.
All right. Public comment. Okay. So, sorry for cutting you off. Now we're done, right?
I'm done.
Okay, good. Thank you. This is all kind of on the good news side, right? Trying for grants or getting them. All right. So with that, need that? All right. Mr. Lynn, project updates is our last item.
With that, we spent a bit of time updating on the 3 projects that you just heard about. If you have any questions about the information that was contained in the packet, I'd be happy to address them.
Any other highlights you want to mention? Then maybe anything happened since the last month or 2 since you weren't here last month?
Well, I guess the big item is 62nd. The bridge slabs are being poured, guardrails being poured. We're almost finished pouring one of the concrete for one of the storm vaults. We're now doing the larger of the 2 storm vaults. Project's going well. We have Lake Drive under construction, so there's traffic control that's occurring along Lake Drive between 10th and 62nd. So the contractor's moving along quite well.
Do you have an estimated opening?
I don't have an estimated date. I can say that it'll be late fall or towards the end of this year.
Before next year?
Yes, before next year, yes. Before the end of this year, the road will be open.
Are we still under budget or on budget?
Yes, we're still very close to contract value that was awarded by the City Council.
Awesome. Very exciting.
One question about an item that was previously on the list but is not this time, which is the Squawk Talus connections. And it seems that it was progressing along, so I wondered if there is any updates or if I should just look for it in future project updates.
There are no updates on that at this time. The staff that's been working on it said just hold on that for a little bit, but they'll bring back updates and look for it in future documents.
I got one just popped in my head, hitting you cold, but on Gilman, since we talked about Gilman earlier, and there's supposed to be a developer that is supposed to put a traffic light in at our 3 trails intersection, and there's a big building built there, and I'm just wondering what the status of timing of that is.
I believe they're working on the design and so forth of it right now and working with the DSD staff for permitting. I don't know the timing of when it will be constructed.
I don't know when it will be constructed, but I believe it's in Development Commission right now. It was in last week and again this week or next week, I believe.
And how does that play out at all in our Gilman design that we're in the middle of?
So the signal will be built based on existing conditions today. And our Gilman concept will evaluate how that might look in the future.
Thank you. Anything else for tonight? Are we good? I do want to just say one thing. We had a projected end time of 9:15, and it's 9:13. So even though we went way over on some items, we made it up on other ones. Thank you very much. And with that, we're adjourned.